Thank you for joining us for another segment of He Calls Me Deborah, beaming a light of hope. Thank you so much for joining. And I would like to give a shout out to our viewers. Appreciate all of any comments that you might send our way and just appreciate you watching. Thank you for watching. All right, well, today we're going to talk about caring for the souls of others. We've spoken about self-care, caring for ourselves in such a way to be prepared to fulfill our commission as Christians, and caring for others as Christ was our model. And we've talked about how self-care can become selfish care when we're more concerned about caring for ourselves than others. And then today we're going to talk about caring for others and their souls. In 1 John 3:18, God's Word says, "Dear children, let us not love with words or tongue, but with actions and in truth." In Psalms 142:4, the psalmist David writes, "I looked to my right hand, and behold, but there was no man that would know me. Refuge failed me. No man cared for my soul." David wrote this prayer when he was being hotly pursued and forced by Saul to run for his life, seeking shelter in a cave. He was being persecuted without cause. And like David, those that are troubled in mind, their body, or concerned about their estate, their belongings, maybe their debt, need compassion. They need to feel cared for. David's heart was as full of his grievances as it could hold, and he is pouring his heart out to God, desperate for someone to hear and care. He found himself in unexpected, dire circumstances for which he had done nothing wrong. Disaster can come from out of nowhere, and no one is immune. Ministry needs can be closer than you ever realized. And I think we know that all too well when we think about Sunday, March 3rd, 2019, when an outbreak of tornadoes slammed through the southwestern United States. And over the course of 6 hours, a total of 41 tornadoes touched down across portions of Alabama, Georgia, Florida, and South Carolina. We remember it well, don't we? Just like 9/11, where were you on 9/11? We can all remember, those of us in the Southeast. We can all remember where we were that day. Lee County, Alabama was struck by a massive tornado, which twisted a path of destruction through communities like Beauregard and killed at least 23 people. Entire families, many children. The storm traveled east-northeast along Old River Road and Biggers Road, continuing straight up Interstate I-185, destroying anything in its path. But we witnessed an immediate outpouring of love, and that's what caring for the soul is. Now, I have been a supporter of Samaritan's Purse for many years. And when this disaster happened, I was sent an email and given an opportunity for the first time. A situation happened close enough at home to where I live that I could actually go and I could help, I could volunteer and be part of the cleanup effort. So I quickly signed up, and I was told to drive to Opelika Saturday morning and to arrive at 7 a.m. their time. So I did so. Now, when I got there, we all met at a church in the sanctuary, and we were all ushered in and divided into groups sitting at tables throughout the room. So you didn't know where you were going to be seated. And then they proceeded to have leadership come in and call people from various parts of the room to be assigned to particular leaders. So we went outside to be given our instructions. And so when I got outside, and we were told, I thought I was going to be helping in Lee County. And so we were told, our instructions were that we were going to be helping off Biggers Road. Well, I thought, well, okay, a lot of cities have the same name. So I asked, is this Biggers Road in Opelika? And they said no, in Muskogee County. So I was like, well, I had just come from that area. I had driven from that area. Now, I knew that Biggers Road in the area that we live in had been hit by the tornado, but I had no idea the level of devastation until I actually started driving down Biggers Road, and it looked like a war scene. It looked like a disaster. And it really made me realize we have no idea how ministry needs can be right in our own neighborhood. So I learned that day. Caring for the souls of others always begins with love. Our spiritual formation should always, at its core, be about learning to love, especially when loving others is uncomfortable or challenging. Expressing that love not in words but in actions, and not just to people in our immediate circles of influence and association, not just those people with whom we are the most familiar. I didn't know anyone on Biggers Road that day. They were not my neighbors, but on that day, from the moment we arrived, they just needed a helping hand. Caring for their souls in this situation meant simply extending a helping hand to clear debris from their yards, to restore for them some degree of normalcy, and to let them know that they were not alone. Caring for the soul are expressions of love. In our schools, there may be children who are neglected or struggling academically, families that have fallen on hard times. Perhaps they go to an after-school program in which you volunteer or could volunteer. Maybe you could find an opportunity to do so. The care and concern that you show may make all the difference in the world to that one child. There may also be children that are brought to our churches. We may open their hearts to ideas of honesty and helping others, perhaps creating an awareness that may help them to consider their behavior and help them to be better prepared in the future to resist the temptation to sin. They may then share what they've learned with other family members, with their friends, or others in their own neighborhood. And what about caring for the souls of the irreligious, those living unmindful of how much God loves them, those we might not normally spend a lot of time with, or those that are more difficult to love, maybe those who keep us at a distance? How can we be more approachable for them? How can we be light bearers in this world of darkness, chaos, and increasing uncertainty? Acts 10, verses 1 through 48, tells a story of Peter. Now, he was visiting at Simon's house in Joppa. And while he was there, he had a vision of a sheet coming down from heaven, filled with unclean animals that were prohibited for consumption by Jewish law. Later, men were sent to Cornelius, the centurion, and they arrive at Simon's house. And Peter seems to then immediately understand the meaning of the vision that he has just had. God was speaking to his heart, urging him to stop viewing Gentiles as unclean. More than just accepting these people into the new community of Christ followers, but rather to personally love those with whom he wouldn't naturally interact. So Peter understands the implications of what this means. God is calling him, just like he calls us, to love in a way that is uncomfortable. So in this instance, Peter doesn't hesitate to invite Cornelius's messengers into Simon's house. And then he proceeds to accompany them back to Cornelius's house the next day. So we also need to be prepared to respond in obedience when our Savior calls us to move into the lives of others in ways that make us uncomfortable, even as Peter did in this passage. But later, Peter's resolve wavers. Now, we know Peter, right? In Matthew 26:35, when Jesus predicted that Peter would deny him, Peter replies, "Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you." But because he was afraid, he ended up denying Jesus not once, but 3 times, just as Jesus had predicted. Now, in Galatians 2:11 through 16, we again see Peter confronted with the issue of how to relate to Gentiles. This time, he's in Antioch, and he's visiting the Christian community there, which included many Gentiles. And so he's been associating with believers like this during this time, right? During meals. But all of a sudden, he stops doing so when men come from James. So James, this time, is sending some new believers. Well, in this passage, the writer Paul goes on to tell us that he has to oppose Peter to his face because he was clearly in the wrong. Peter, the primary leader of the young church, had been asked by God, right? He'd already been asked to cease distancing himself from Gentiles, and once again, he was doing the exact same thing, distancing himself. But maybe we shouldn't be so hard on Peter, though. Ask yourself this: how many times has the Lord clearly taught us something, yet we continue to struggle with living it out in our lives? It is one thing to know a principle. It is another thing altogether to apply it when we're trying to learn to love real people in a real world. So once again, Peter feared man, and we often do the same. Peter was susceptible to the same kind of social pressure that we too must resist. If you take the time to think about it, how often has our own Christian communities, of which there are so many, right? How many times has your own Christian community developed a standard of behavior that defines what is deemed acceptable? The word for this is status quo. For Peter, it was the issue of unclean animals prohibited for consumption by Jewish law. The Jews were judging the Gentiles as unclean because of their diet. How often are we in the Christian community guilty of having a status quo when it comes to spiritual formation? Maybe we've placed emphasis on personal Bible study, participation in a fellowship group, a small group, or witnessing to non-believers. These nuances can be subtle, but how loving are they? Love, as modeled by Christ, who in turn is our model, does not default to the status quo, the existing state of affairs. Now, don't get me wrong. These established standards are not always bad. Pressure to stay within accepted limits can provide powerful support against temptation. The problem with assessing spiritual maturity according to spiritual activities, right, the things we do because we're Christians, is that the degree to which a person is learning to love others well is often overlooked. So maybe they're not a part of a fellowship group. Maybe they've missed a few meetings, but maybe there's a shut-in that they're giving time and attention to. Or maybe they've been neglecting a family member and they're choosing to be more loving and spend more time with that family member. They're learning to love others well, but they're being judged for the spiritual activities that we look to see that they're not participating in. Another example is that a person may value feeding the homeless and hand them a sandwich, but fail to fully consider what loving that person at that moment might involve. What if they're rushed when they serve that sandwich? What if they're distracted? What if they fail to make eye contact? Or maybe, like Emily Dickinson says, maybe it's precisely a smile at that moment in time that their soul needs the most, that would be deemed to them appreciated as loving even more than the sandwich that you just hurriedly put on their plate. Love is not primarily concerned with sinning less. Let me say that again. Love is not primarily concerned with sinning less. In Matthew 22, Jesus does not say, when the Pharisees asked him, "What is the greatest commandment, Rabbi? What is the greatest commandment?" Jesus didn't say, "Stop all of your sinning. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it, stay away from everyone who sins." Placing too much emphasis on avoiding sin can actually be a major distraction from the higher aim of the Christian life. The higher aim is that of learning to love others well. It becomes a distraction that blinds us from seeing and serving those whom God brings across our path. When we're hurried, when we're distracted, when we're frustrated, remember that. The men who had come to Antioch, the men who had been sent by James to Peter, were not just influenced by status quo. They believed in a status quo view that was in error. If we may revisit Acts 10:28, these men still believed that the Gentiles were unclean, and that associating with them would somehow make them unclean as well. And because of their opinion, Peter was influenced as well to not receive them the way he would have if they had not been present at the time. Their thinking was flawed, and ours can be too. In Matthew 22:37-40, Jesus says that we are first to love the Lord our God with all our heart, with all our soul, and with all of our mind. And the second greatest commandment is to love our neighbors as ourselves. So again, the chief aim of the Christian life is that of a movement from self to God and others, not just about sinning less and walking in righteousness. And at the same time, resisting sin is an important endeavor, but it's secondary to that of learning to love well. Sinful behavior and habits are always destructive to ourselves and others. Sin is composed of attitudes and actions that keep us from loving well. You could say that sin is anti-love. It does not seek the best interest of others. It doesn't even represent an attempt at serving oneself well. It is ultimately destructive to us, our endeavors to love others well, and to the best interest of others. So again, it's a secondary objective. Overcoming our destructive behaviors should always be a means to the end of becoming capable of loving and serving others well. Jesus is our model. Consider the story of Zacchaeus in Luke 19, Zacchaeus' conversion, right? Jesus was entering Jericho. Zacchaeus was eager to meet him, but he was lost in the crowd. How many people do our paths cross who are lost in the crowd? He was a man short in stature, and so he climbed a sycamore tree. Jesus was assertive. He inserted himself into this man's life, this tax collector who was despised by the people. Jesus took criticism from the religious leaders because he was the guest of a sinner. He told Zacchaeus, he said, "I need to come to your house today." He inserted himself into Zacchaeus' life. And as a result, he was criticized again by the religious leaders who were following status quo, right? He's a tax collector. He's a sinner. Better not associate. And if you do, you're criticized. But Jesus was compassionate, and he was concerned for this man's soul, not the opinion of others. Jesus modeled love that is willing to be made uncomfortable to minister to another. So think about this, okay? Now, we can give food to a food bank, right? You go to the store, you get some extra things, you take them to a food bank. That doesn't really involve, it's a monetary sacrifice, but it doesn't really, you're at the store anyway, so it's not like it really requires that much. All right, then think about the next step, serving the homeless in a shelter on Thanksgiving. I mean, I think that that's very meaningful, and I'm not saying that it isn't meaningful, but I want you to take it one step higher, okay? What about inviting a homeless person into your home for Thanksgiving dinner with your family? Which one of those things, giving food to a food bank, serving the homeless in a shelter, or inviting a homeless person into your home, causes the most discomfort? Which one becomes the most personal? It's the last one, right? Inviting the homeless person into your home to share your home, your family, your time, your meal. Those are the kinds of connections that Jesus made. We may be called to care for the souls of members of God's family. And caring for the souls of others may mean ministering to someone within your church family who's in need of a kind sympathy or an encouraging word. I think we're all pretty good at that. Maybe it's just making a phone call to check on someone you haven't seen at church in a while, to let them know that you're thinking of them and concerned about how they're doing. Or maybe it's taking the time to visit a shut-in, someone longing for the warmth of companionship. And maybe that means making a sacrifice, because this is time that you might have something else you were planning to do. And what about those who've learned from sad experience, the consequences of a life of sin and poor choices? Maybe they just need words of encouragement to help them find a better way. They matter to God. Jesus had compassion. In Matthew 9:36, he was moved with compassion. He said, if only you knew what would bring you peace, but now it has been hidden from your eyes. Now he knew, as he looked upon the masses, he knew that they were like sheep without a shepherd because they were harassed and they were helpless. The shepherd provides close companionship for his sheep. They instantly recognize the shepherd and they respond to his voice. Isn't that what we should do? We can also care for the souls of members of our own family. by not taking them or their need to be heard for granted, by instead taking the time to really listen, to practice the art of listening in a healing way. And I have a confession to make here. I have not always been a good listener. I have not always listened in a healing way. And for that, I am gravely sorry. And for that, I have sought to change, because I've seen firsthand the damage that it can do to relationships with those that you love the most. Just a moment of being preoccupied or being flippant and not meaning to be can do untold damage. And let me read something here in closing. James E. Miller writes on the subject of listening in a healing way, and I quote, "Healing listening favors wholeness. The root word for heal means to become hale or to make whole. When we listen to others in a healing way, we affirm the belief that we can become more complete as they express and claim what they have within them to say. This increasing completeness usually occurs gradually, progressively, but sometimes it can occur quickly. At times, the other person is aware of this growing wholeness as they are speaking or as they finish. At other times, they can become aware only upon reflection, reflecting upon how well the other person was listening and how much they were able to pour out from deep within themselves that needed to be shared. When we listen in a healing way, we carry no agenda for the other person or for ourselves. We listen because we choose to listen without knowing what will transpire, without needing to know. We listen because the other person is worth being listened to. We listen because we know from our own experience, love affirming, how affirming it is when someone carefully hears us in a way that honors who we are as whole human beings. We listen because we know how freeing it is to be accepted just as we are, without preconceptions and without judgment. And that sounds like a good topic for our next discussion. What does it mean to listen in a healing way? Till next time, thanks for joining.